Chapter 25 of The Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 25. Dangers of the Prairie. Our travelers attacked by Indians and delivered in a remarkable manner. There are periods in the life of almost all men when misfortunes seem to crowd upon them in rapid succession, when they escape from one danger only to encounter another, and when, to use a well-known expression, they succeed in leaping out of the frying pan at the expense of plunging into the fire. So was it with our three friends upon this occasion. They were scarcely rid of the Blackfeet, who found them too watchful to be caught napping, when, about daybreak one morning, they encountered a roving band of Comanche Indians, who wore such a warlike aspect that Joe deemed it prudent to avoid them if possible.
"They don't see us yet, I guess," said Joe, as he and his companions drove the horses into a hollow between the grassy waves of the prairie. "And if we can only escape their sharp eyes till we're in yonder clump of willows, we're safe enough."
"But why don't you ride up to 'em, Joe," inquired Dick, "and make peace with 'em and the pale faces, as you ha' done with other bands?"
"Because it's of no use to risk our scalps for the chance of making peace with a roving war party. Keep your head down, Henry. If they get only a sight of the top of your cap, they'll be down on us like a breeze o' wind."
"Ha! Let them come," said Henry.
"They'll come without asking your leave," remarked Joe dryly.
Notwithstanding his defiant expression, Henry had sufficient prudence to induce him to bend his head and shoulders, and in a few minutes they reached the shelter of the willows unseen by the savages. At least, so thought Henry. Joe was not quite sure about it, and Dick hoped for the best. In the course of half an hour, the last of the Comanches was seen to hover for a second on the horizon, like a speck of black against the sky, and then to disappear. Immediately the three hunters bolted on their steeds and resumed their journey. But before that evening closed, they had sad evidence of the savage nature of the band from which they had escaped. On passing the brow of a slight eminence, Dick, who rode first, observed that Crusoe stopped and snuffed the breeze in an anxious, inquiring manner. "What is it, pup?" said Dick, drawing up, for he knew that his faithful dog never gave a false alarm. Crusoe replied by a short, uncertain bark, and then, bounding forward, disappeared behind a little wooded knoll. In another moment a long, dismal howl floated over the plains. There was a mystery about the dog's conduct, which, coupled with his melancholy cry, struck the travellers with a superstitious feeling of dread as they sat looking at each other in surprise.
"Come on, let's clear it up,"
cried Joe Blunt, shaking the reins of his steed and galloping forward. A few strides brought them to the other side of the knoll, where, scattered upon the torn and bloody turf, they discovered the scalped and mangled remains of about 20 or 30 human beings. Their skulls had been cleft by the tomahawk, and their breasts pierced by the scalping knife, and from the position in which many of them lay, it was evident that they had been slain while asleep. Joe's brow flushed, and his lips became tightly compressed as he muttered between his set teeth,
"Their skins are white."
A short examination sufficed to show that the men who had thus been barbarously murdered while they had slept had been a band of trappers or hunters, but what their errand had been, or whence they came, they could not discover. Everything of value had been carried off, and all the scalps had been taken. Most of the bodies, although much mutilated, lay in a posture that led our hunters to believe they had been killed while asleep. But one or two were cut almost to pieces. From the blood bespattered and trampled sward around, it seemed as if they had struggled long and fiercely for life. Whether or not any of the savages had been slain, it was impossible to tell, for if such had been the case, Their comrades, doubtless, had carried away their bodies. That they had been slaughtered by the party of Comanches who had been seen at daybreak was quite clear to Joe, but his burning desire to revenge the death of the white men had to be stifled, as his party was so small. Long afterwards it was discovered that this was a band of trappers, who, like those mentioned at the beginning of this volume, had set out to avenge the death of a comrade. But God, who has retained the right of vengeance in his own hand, saw fit to frustrate their purpose by giving them into the hands of the savages whom they had set forth to slay. As it was impossible to bury so many bodies, the travelers resumed their journey and left them to bleach there in the wilderness. But they rode the whole of that day almost without uttering a word. Meanwhile the Comanches, who had observed the trio, had ridden away at first for the purpose of deceiving them into the belief that they had passed unobserved, doubled on their track, and took a long sweep in order to keep out of sight until they could approach under the shelter of a belt of woodland towards which the travelers now approached. The Indians adopted this course, instead of the easier method of simply pursuing so weak a party, because the plains at this part were bordered by a long stretch of forest, into which the hunters could have plunged and rendered pursuit more difficult, if not almost useless. The detour thus taken was so extensive, and the shades of evening were beginning to descend before they could put their plan into execution. The forest lay about a mile to the right of our hunters, like some dark mainland, of which the prairie was the sea, and the scattered clumps of wood the islands. "There's no lack of game here," said Dick Varley, pointing to a herd of buffaloes which rose at their approach and fled away towards the woods. "I never feel it onnatural hot like this without looking out for a plump." "Ha! Den we better look out for one good tree to get below," suggested Henri. "Voila!" he added, pointing with his finger towards the plain. "Dere am a lot of wild hosses." A troop of about 30 wild horses appeared, as he spoke, on the brow of a ridge, and advanced slowly toward them. "Hist!" exclaimed Joe, reining up. "Hold on, lads. Wild horses. My rifle to pop gun. There's wilder men on the other side of 'em." "What d'ye mean, Joe?" inquired Dick, riding close up. "D'ye see the little lumps on the shoulder of each horse?" said Joe. "Them's Injuns' feet, and if we don't want to lose our scalps, we'd better make for the forest." Joe proved himself to be in earnest by wheeling round and making straight for the thick woods as fast as his horse could run. The others followed, driving the pack horses before them. The effect of this sudden movement on the so-called wild horses was very remarkable, and to one unacquainted with the habits of the Comanche Indians must have appeared almost supernatural. In the twinkling of an eye every steed had a rider on its back, and before the hunters had taken 5 strides in the direction of the forest, the whole band were in hot pursuit, yelling like furies. The manner in which these Indians accomplish this feat is very singular, and implies great activity and strength of muscle on the part of the savages. The Comanches are low in stature, and usually are rather corpulent. In their movements on foot they are heavy and ungraceful, and they are, on the whole, a slovenly and unattractive race of men. But the instant they mount their horses they seem to be entirely changed, and surprise the spectator with the ease and elegance of their movements. Their great and distinctive peculiarity as horsemen is the power they have acquired of throwing themselves suddenly on either side of their horse's body, and clinging on in such a way that no part of them is visible from the other side save the foot by which they cling. In this manner they approach their enemies at full gallop, and without rising again to the saddle discharge their arrows at them over their horses' backs, or even under their necks. This apparently magical feat is accomplished by means of a halter or horse chair, which is passed round under the neck of the horse, and both ends braided into the mane on the withers, thus forming a loop which hangs under the neck and against the breast. This being caught by the hand makes a sling, into which the elbow falls, taking the weight of the body on the middle of the upper arm. Into this loop the rider drops suddenly and fearlessly, leaving his heel to hang over